I'm also just started the recording, so you should all know that the recording is going to be, we're recording this. Also, I want to share that we have, if you look in your toolbar, and some of you are on computers, some of you are on phones, some of you are on iPads, but there is a chat function here. And I want you to all go and click on chat. And if you have questions for Rabbi Dan, along the way, he's going to present first, and then we'll pick up questions intermittently during his program. But if you have a question, just type your question in, I'll see it, and I will bring you forward to ask the question to Dan directly. Also, if you notice, there is a tool that Zoom gives you, which is called reactions, which is, there's a little smiley face with a plus sign. I'd like you to click on that now, and you'll see that there's a raised hand marker there. You see all of a sudden when I click on raised hand, you see it on my tile, a raised hand. So in order for us to be able to actively handle this many people, I need you to help me out by raising your hand. I will make sure that I will get to you. If I skip you, then just unmute yourself and say, hey, I have my question. And so I want to welcome you to Cain and Abel, and welcome Rabbi Dan Orenstein from Albany. I'd like to give you a little background on Dan. Dan Orenstein is the rabbi at Congregation Ohav Shalom in Albany, New York. And he's also teaches Judaic studies in the Middle School of Hebrew Academy of Capital District, also in Albany. He also blogs for the Times of Israel, contributes essays to Northeast Public Radio, and has contributed to the Scribe at the Jewish Forward. He has also contributed to multi-volumes of Mizora Matrix book series on Judaism. He's married, his wife Marian Alexander are the proud parents of Joseph, Shulamit, and Vared. He also has written, as we're going to discuss today, Cain and Abel, a Jewish courtroom drama, and it's published by the Jewish Publication Society. Also, we're going to start today by playing a little bit of a trailer that kind of gets everyone in the sense of what Dan is going to be presenting. And I'm going to do that now. So I'm going to share my screen. And you're going to shortly hear the trailer. And just give me a thumbs up if you can hear it.
In the center of the fiercest fighting in the Civil War, the United Nations has been able to do very little to help the people.
As a Rwandan and an anti-genocide activist who lost many members of my family to genocide, I could not think of a better project to be part of than one that shows how all of us can make a difference.
My father was a young diplomat in 1943. My father was told to stop giving these passports and helping the Jewish community escape the island.
German plates.
My mother was thrown to the ground and she died the following Saturday.
Lupfitz, a member of the Nazi Party, had by his efforts organized the rescue of 7,200 people. An amazing feat of goodness from someone who had been trained in the art of evil. I feel so peculiar standing here with you because you're alive.
It is terrible that so many people had to die, where 600,000 Jews lived before, and at the end of the war, 90,000 has left to live.
You don't connect these bureaucratic actions to the actual saving of a life.
Yeah. Not when you see you, though.
What would you say to Frank Foley today if you met him?
Thank you for saving our lives. Thank you.
When you reflect on the diplomats, the phrase, the mystery of goodness, is it a mystery, or do you think goodness is actually a deep-seated human virtue which emerges?
I know there can be hope. I've learned that when we see crimes against humanity, we cannot turn the other way. Instead, we must transform our fears into courage to take action.
Come on. What in the hell happened?
Okay.
No, I don't want my hand up.
All right. Whoever's making, we need to mute everyone. So I'm going to mute everyone. There we go. And Rabbi, I just muted you. So unmute yourself, please.
I am unmuted.
Okay, perfect. Well, I want to welcome you to our program. I also want to call out a couple special guests. Rabbi Dan's parents are here, Sheila and Sheldon Orenstein, which is terrific. I also want to let you know that in that broadcast and also coming later is the work of Sir Martin Gilbert. And Esther Gilbert is here with us. And why don't you raise your hand there, Esther, so we can see you. We're so excited to have Esther on board. Esther is a great fan of our programming. And in fact, Esther is going to be representing a program in December with us. So we want to make sure that everyone gets recognized. So Dan, I'm going to turn it over to you. Again, for those of you who are recently joining, and if you have a question for Dan, please use your chat, put the questions in chat. We'll take questions at periodic parts in the presentation and certainly open up at the end for discussion. Go ahead, Dan, the program's all yours.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. Folks, it's great to be here. It's really an incredible honor. I have to say, first of all, I'm so thankful that Jeffrey has and I have sort of, as we've kind of developed kind of a comradeship and a friendship over the past several months, that he's encouraged me to come on and to teach and to learn with you today and to continue to learn with this group, which has grown exponentially over the past several months. So thank you, Jeffrey. Thanks that my parents are here. I have a number of family members here as well. My mother-in-law, Rosalie Alexander. I have an uncle, my Uncle Sandy, the Aronsons, lots of family who are here, and of course you guys as well. So I'm really very, very pleased to be here today. I do want to just point out, and I just want to tell you, Esther, Martin's books are some of my most cherished books that I have ever read. Anytime I need a great go-to for history, especially for Jewish history, it's always Sir Martin Gilbert's books, and just a man of towering intellect and heart who just puts so much into the world and whose legacy continues. And I just love reading his books, and thank God he put that into the world as well. So it's a pleasure to be with you here today. Folks, it's really wonderful to be here. I want to start today by reading to you a comment by Imre Báthori. Now, who was Imre Báthori? Imre Báthori was a simple Hungarian farmer, a very, very religious man, who decided almost on a whim, as he was riding on a train and saw a young man by the name of Martin Wiesel, young 24-year-old man, who was clearly visibly anxious and shaken when pro-Nazi guards were getting on the train looking for ID papers, who decided almost on a whim, or so it seems that it was almost on a whim, to walk up to this young man, gain his trust, protect him, hide him. He figured out that the young man pretty quickly was a Jewish man, and then later on take 4 other members of his family into his home during the duration of the Shoah, during the duration of World War II. What's interesting, of course, is that Imre Báthori is not particularly well known, I don't think he is, in the annals of great Hasidei Umot HaOlam, the righteous of the nations of the world, what Eva Folgeman, the great social psychologist, of course, has called rescuers during the Holocaust. And yet his story struck me as I was walking around Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial Authority in Jerusalem, just a few years ago with a synagogue group. We were visiting Israel, and Báthori's statement that he made when he received his honor as one of the righteous, and sort of had his tree planted along the Avenue of the Righteous at Yad Vashem. It was Báthori's comment about Cain and Abel, about the story, which of course is a story near and dear to my heart, that struck me as so simple, but so profound and so beautiful that I just had to capture it. And it's one of the things that got me thinking about rescuers, even a small segment of rescuers during the Shoah, and the story of Cain and Abel. What is it that some rescuers, maybe many rescuers, might have taken from a common culture of religious education in Europe, particularly from that story, which many of them would have learned in Sunday school or in church or wherever they were? What was it about that story that explicitly or implicitly created a framework and a foundation for them to think about their Jewish neighbors not as the other, but as the brother or as the sister? So let me read to you what Batory said. It's an absolutely amazing thing. I was only a vessel through which the Lord's purpose was fulfilled. I know, and listen to this, folks, this gives me a chill. It's so incredible. I know that when I stand before God on Judgment Day, I shall not be asked the question posed to Cain: where were you when your brother's blood was crying out to God? Batory, again, was a simple Hungarian farmer. We don't know very much about him. We know that he wasn't necessarily well educated, that he wasn't a particularly sophisticated or worldly person. But here, as a religious person with a very powerful, very, very centered moral and religious core, at the very, very sort of center of his being, Batory recognized that if he was going to stand before God on Judgment Day and be told by God, you didn't do anything differently than Cain did when your brother's blood, meaning Abel's blood, or the blood of the Jewish people, cried out from the ground, you will be just as guilty as your distant human ancestor Cain. In such simple but beautiful and eloquent language, Batory, I think, really hit the nail on the head. The Cain and Abel story, at least for him, and a select number of other rescuers during the Shoah, made a difference, not necessarily in terms of what they were thinking at the very moment when they were engaging in rescue, but sort of in the background, sort of what made up their character, their motivations to go ahead. And as any of us who has studied sort of, the history of rescuers and rescuer movements during the Shoah, we know these were people risking their own lives every second of the day. These were people risking the lives of their families who were not always happy with them because of the fact that they weren't making decisions about saving Jews. So Cain and Abel seems to really have made a difference implicitly, if not explicitly. Now, folks, I want to say something to you, and I have been told you never want to tell a rabbi he has more time to speak than less, because given our druthers, what will rabbis do? Well, what all clergy do, we'll talk a lot. But we do have a fair amount of time today to actually look not only at some of these stories of rescuers who spoke the language of the Cain and Abel story of the Bible, to kind of think about the framework within which they made the decisions to save Jews, but we're going to look at the story itself. We're going to look at a bunch of different things kind of surrounding that story. And don't worry if you don't remember pieces of the story, or if you haven't looked at it since Hebrew school or day school or synagogue or church or whatever. We'll look at that story together, and we'll try to ask some important questions about what that story as a foundational story of Western and world culture is trying to tell us. Now, folks, please remember, as Jeffrey had said before, if you have questions, throw them into the chat. We'll take a break every so often just to come back and ask some of those questions, okay? And I'll try to get to as many questions as I can. Let me do this right now. We started with Imre Batory, this very, very brave Hungarian man who saved the lives of 5 Jews in the Wiesel family. I want to do this right now. I want to share with you just a few sources that we're going to be using today to kind of try to talk about how Cain and Abel may possibly or really was a framework, at least implicitly, for how rescuers thought about their lives and their work. Eva Fogelman, in her book, and I don't know how many of you have had a chance to look at Conscience and Courage, this is still one of my favorite books on rescuers, precisely because of the fact that Fogelman is a social psychologist. She wasn't just telling stories about rescuers, she studied them. She really thought about them in social psychological terms. And so to me, it still stands out, Conscience and Courage still stands out as one of the great, great books sort of the late 20th century, early 21st century, that tries to really understand who were rescuers, what motivated them, why did they do what they did, knowing perfectly well that if they did it, they could be caught tortured, and murdered by the Nazis. So let's take a look. Folks, just give me the thumbs up that you can see my sources. I want to make sure everybody can see what I'm showing you today. All right, great. Just wanted to make sure about that. So let me just read to you a little bit of what I wrote here. Some rescuers during the Shoah were implicitly influenced by this widespread value of people's responsibilities towards each other, as expressed in the story of Cain and Abel. This is an idea that reaches back in our consciousness to that narrative, if not even further. I want to submit that on rare occasions, rescuers, and we know that many of them were reticent to speak about their experiences, spoke about what they did in terms of seeing Jews, the other, as brothers and as sisters. And that the Cain and Abel story, which emphasizes, as you'll see, the notion of brotherhood over and over and over again, was, if not explicitly, certainly implicitly part of their thinking. And of course, on even rarer occasions, rescuers spoke about what they did explicitly in terms of the Cain and Abel narrative, as we saw with Imre Báthory before. Báthory was very clear. As a religious Christian who knew the Bible, he was willing to say, my understanding of what I did had to do with coming before God on Judgment Day and being able to say to God, I protected the Jews, I protected Abel from being murdered by Cain, the Nazis. So what are we going to do today? We're going to look at the Cain and Abel story, right? I don't want anybody to assume that if you haven't looked at or thought about the story, in quite some time, that we're going to kind of do this sight unseen. We'll look at the story. Number one, we're going to look at how one modern writer used the story to explore human hatred and violence during the Shoah, and in general human experience. And that writer was Dan Pagis. Pagis, until his death, I believe in 1986, was one of Israel's greatest poets and literary critics. He was an amazing writer. And one of his most famous poems, as you'll see, is a poem called Written in Pencil in the Boxcar. I don't know how many of you have seen that poem. It is a chilling poem. It does not take a very positive and happy view of humanity since the time of Cain and Abel, but it's an important poem to read, especially since it's by a Shoah survivor. Number three, we will look at a little bit of Michael King's documentary, The Rescuers, which Jeffrey started us out with, with the trailer. And we're going to look at one particular story, not Imre Báthory's story, but Sulahatin Ulkumen's story. He was a diplomat on the island of Rhodes, and he saved the Jews, many Jews on the island of Rhodes. So as you'll see, number four, we'll talk about Sulahatin Ulkumen, and then we'll learn a little bit more about Imre Báthory's story, and then we'll wrap up with questions and comments. Jeffrey, yeah.
We have a question. How do you spell Báthory? And the first name as well.
Imre, I-M-R-E, which I believe sort of with an accent mark over the E. Báthory, at least the way in which it's spelled, I assume in Hungarian, but I'm not sure, is B-A-T-H-O-R-Y.
Thank you.
Imre Báthory. Imre Báthory. Okay, so folks, so how do I want to start this out? Before we even get to the story of Cain and Abel itself found in the Bible, let me say one thing, and this is really important, and I always try to emphasize this with whatever group I'm working with. Ladies and gentlemen, please understand, when I read stories like Cain and Abel, I'm not interested in whether or not the story is literally true, okay? What matters about this story is not its literal truth, it's its truth. Now, what do I mean by that? Mordechai Kaplan of blessed memory, the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism, one of the great philosophical and religious minds of the Jewish people of the 20th century, Dr. Kaplan of blessed memory once said that our job is to help students of the Bible or students of religion to take the Bible seriously without taking it literally. Think about that for a second. Taking the Bible seriously without taking it literally. It doesn't matter if there was an Adam and Eve and a Cain and Abel. In some respects, who cares? Cain and Abel are a composite. They are, as I said before, a mythic, sort of like a foundation story that our ancestors of blessed memory, and I believe truly inspired spiritually by God, put together as a way of talking about timeless issues such as the brother as other, right? Am I my brother's keeper? Your brother's blood is, crying out from the ground. The story itself may not be literally true, right? But its values continue to be true. And that's what matters about a story like Cain and Abel, not whether or not there really is a Cain and Abel. How is it that if there was only Cain and Abel in the world, somehow Cain had kids and then the world got populated? These are questions that people have asked for thousands of years. They're interesting enough, but I'm more interested in what the story is trying to tell us. What is it trying to teach us? So let's remember that. Now, second, before we begin, let's look at words about Cain and Abel from that greatest of all rabbis, Rabbi Bruce Springsteen, the great rock and roll artist. It was Springsteen, and I was just telling some people about this. It was Springsteen. I don't know how well any of you know his music. You know that Springsteen's been around for many, many years now and is considered to be one of the great iconic American rock and folk singers and composers, really of American history. He actually just wrote a book and based upon a podcast that he did with Barack Obama. Fascinating stuff. It was Springsteen who was one of my influences in trying to understand the story of Cain and Abel in the first place. Look at what he says in his song, Adam Raised a Cain. Now, Adam Raised a Cain is Springsteen's kind of semi-autobiographical song about his very dysfunctional and twisted and often dark relationship with his own father, And this is what he says. In the Bible, Cain slew Abel, and east of Eden he was cast. You're born into this life paying for the sins of somebody else's past. Springsteen is making a point here, which is that from the time of Cain and Abel, the time of that murderous sibling rivalry, the time of that, that sort of the, as it were, the foundations of humanity, the first family, right? Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel. From that time to our own, we have carried on a heritage and a tradition as human beings, which is essentially destructive and murderous. We have no clue about what it means to truly be each other's brothers and sisters. This is a dark song. And Springsteen, of course, uses the biblical story of Cain and Abel to make the point not only about the horrible things that his own father handed down to him, that he, if you read his memoir, he has struggled with all his life, but it's also a story that tries to explain for us, as Springsteen tries to show, why it is that human beings in general never seem to stop chasing their tails when it comes to treating each other in the right kind of way. We are always acting out the horrible story of Cain and Abel. That's part of what he's trying to say here. Now, of course, we could say that, in fact, that's one way of reading this story. Cain and Abel is a powerful reading of how sibling hatred in the nuclear and the global human families, it's inherited, right? It's handed down from generation to generation, no matter what people in families, any kind of family, any configuration of family, at any level of family try to do, we never can seem to stop hurting each other. We just don't know how to treat each other like brother and sister. That's one way in which to understand the story. Let's call it the Bruce Springsteen school of understanding the story. And then there's another way, which is that the Cain and Abel story is not only a very powerful reading about sibling hatred, it is a powerful reading about the possibilities of sibling responsibility and how that is inherited as well. Now, during the Shoah, millions of people lived by the first reading. Passively, actively, you know perfectly well, folks, that there were so many millions of people who, either out of just fear or because really, to be fair, because they just didn't see a way that they could, get around the Nazi monster, simply did not do anything for Jews. And sometimes, a lot of the time, that was motivated by just basic anti-Semitism. What do we care about these Jews? I'm not going to risk my life for the Jewish guy down the street. It's his problem, not mine. But during the Shoah, there were rescuers, not a whole lot. We know, I think that Yad Vashem numbers now among sort of the people that has honored as rescuers to be maybe 22,000. There are probably others as well who were never recognized, but it's not a huge number of people out of all the people in Europe who were in one way or another complicit in what the Nazis were doing. Rescuers nonetheless decided, I'm going to live by the second reading, right? The other reading of Cain and Abel, which we're going to look at in just a second. And that is that as hard as it is, as unnatural as it might feel sometimes, as much as we may not want to, ultimately you have to treat the other as brother. That person down the street, that neighbor, that store owner on the block is not just that Jew who the Nazis can take away. That person is your brother. That person is someone you have to defend. You've got to do something for that person. So we're going to focus on that today. We're going to look at both of these tensions in the story and kind of tease out a little bit about how rescuers decided to live by the second reading. What motivated them in the story to live by the reading of Cain and Abel, which is about treating the other as brother and not about one brother murdering the other. Okay? So can we keep going? Let's keep going. Let's see what we've got here, folks. So we're now going to come to the story itself. And again, please remember what I said to you before. Don't worry about whether or not the story is literally true. That's not its purpose in the Bible. I've decided specifically not to add the Hebrew in the text here because I want everybody to be on the same page and all of us to kind of look at the words together and to understand it together. But, if we need to, we'll come up with some of the Hebrew if we need to. So here we go. Genesis chapter 4. Now, what's the context? Adam and Eve have been kicked out of Eden. They've been kicked out of Eden for eating from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which is another way of saying knowledge of basically everything. God realizes that by willfully, freely taking from that fruit that they were forbidden, Adam and Eve, the founders of humanity, now possess just as much intelligence, just as much intellectual prowess as God does. And it's at that point that God says back in chapter 3, get out of here. I can't have you here anymore, because if you eat from the tree of life, not only will you be as smart as I am, not only will you possess the same kind of creative power that I do, you will live forever and you will then become God. And I can't have that. So that's sort of our context, right? Here we are now. It's Genesis chapter 4. They're outside of Eden. Adam and Eve are starting a family. Now the man knew his wife, Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I've gained a male child with the help of the Lord. She then bore his brother Abel. Abel became a keeper of sheep. Cain became a tiller of the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought an offering to God from the fruit of the soil. Abel, for his part, brought the choicest of the firstlings of his flock. God paid heed to Abel and his offering, but to Cain and his offering, God paid no heed. Cain was much distressed and his face fell, literally, by plu panav, which means in Hebrew, he was so angry and depressed and enraged that it showed physically in his body. God said to Cain, why are you distressed? Why is your face fallen? Surely, if you do right, there is uplift. But if you don't do right, sin crouches at the door. Some would translate it as couches at the door. It's the same image, though. Imagine sin almost as a monster about to pounce on you. Its urge, sin's urge, is toward you, yet you can be its master. Cain said to his brother Abel, and notice here, ... something seems to be missing in the text. When they were in the field, Cain set upon his brother Abel and killed him. God said to Cain, where's your brother Abel? And he said, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? Then God said, what have you done? Hark, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Therefore, you shall be more cursed than the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. If you till the soil, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. You shall become a ceaseless wanderer on earth. Cain said to God, my punishment is too great to bear. Or another translation, Cain said to God, my sin is too great to bear. Since you, God, have banished me this day from the soil, and I must avoid your presence and become a restless wanderer on earth, anyone who meets me may kill me. God said to him, I promise, if anyone kills Cain, sevenfold vengeance shall be taken on him. And God put a mark on Cain, lest anyone who met him should kill him. Cain left the presence of God and settled in the land of Nod, which in Hebrew means wandering, east of Eden. And of course, East of Eden is where John Steinbeck gets the title for his iconic American novel, one of my favorite novels, East of Eden, which uses the Cain and Abel story as a way of thinking about a family in the 19th century in California. All right, folks, now if usually what I would do in a class like this one, and say in a program like this, where we weren't being specifically focused on just studying the story together, I would ask people, go ahead, put your questions out there. You be the rabbis, you be the interpreters. Break open the text. What are some of your questions? So I'll tell you what, why don't we do this? As we're looking at these very focused questions for discussion, which I'd love to hear from folks what you think. If you have questions about the text itself, comments, thoughts, the story of Cain and Abel never fails to elicit lots and lots of strong opinions and questions. I assure you of that. Throw them into the chat, any questions that you have, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can kind of over the duration of the next hour or so. But as you're doing that, as you're sort of thinking about some of the questions that sort of were raised for you, that might have sort of bothering you about the story of Cain and Abel, let me focus with you on three very specific questions, which I think really can help us to understand more how the Cain and Abel story, at least implicitly, if not explicitly, was a framework for many rescuers, particularly those who were religious, right? People who really looked to the Bible, looked to their Christian faith, at times looked to their Muslim faith to try to understand what they needed to do for these Jews who were being murdered by the Nazis. All right, number one, God speaks about sin, evil doing. Let's just sort of use that. Sin as kind of the personification here of the human capacity to do evil, as a living thing which wants to pounce on Cain, right? He's crouching at the door, but whom Cain can defeat. How might this warning of God, let me just put a question mark in there, hold on a second. There you go. How might this warning of God to Cain about our freedom to master evil, actually, you know what, that was a bad sentence, guys. What I was trying to say there is, what would be sort of the message of this warning to God to Cain about our freedom to master evil? That's one question, okay? What does this mean in terms of how people, clearly a select number of people during the Shoah, during the Holocaust, would have made a choice to do the right thing and to save Jews even at great peril to their own lives? This idea that you can master sin, that you can master evil. Let's think about that. Number two, an even bigger question here. The word brother is mentioned 7 times in a story that is a mere 16 verses long. Remember something, ladies and gentlemen, if you look at the Cain and Abel story, it has an outsized influence on the way that we think about so much in contemporary culture, but it's only 16 verses long. There's an additional 10 verses sort of in kind of the aftermath of the Cain story that are sort of like the second part of the story, but the actual story of Cain murdering his brother is only 16 verses long in the Bible. That's not very much. And yet the word brother, as you may have seen, see where I bolded them all, comes up 7 times. 7 times in a very, very short story. Why so much repetition? In other words, what might this excessive use of the word brother be teaching us readers? And number 3, how might this emphasis on the word brother in our text have influenced rescuers who learned the story at home, in church, in mosque, in popular media? So those are our 3 questions. I'd love to hear what folks have to say about it. I'm going to give you some of my own thoughts right now, and then use that as a little bit of a kind of formational framework for understanding the story as a kind of an underlying motivational basis for rescuers during the Shoah. Yeah, Jeffrey. I think you're muted. I think you're muted. I think you were muted there.
Yeah. Okay, we do have some questions coming in. So I want
Go
to
ahead.
call on the person who asked them to unmute and then ask the question. So Joanne, you put a question in, so please, so Rabbi can see you.
And I'll tell you what I'm going to do. You know what, Jeffrey, I'm sorry for interrupting. Let me stop the share for a second,
Yep.
because that way I can actually talk to people.
Yep.
And then we'll go back into some of these questions a little bit later. That's fine.
Right. So the first question is, Joan, why don't you ask your question? Unmute yourself and you can ask your question.
Joan, I think you're muted.
Joan Gray, are you there with us? Unmute yourself, Joan. Maybe I can help you. Okay, we'll come back. How about Esty? Where is Esty? So we can ask your question. Unmute yourself, Esty. Where are you? Are you hearing me?
I'll tell you what, Jeffrey, if you want to just read me the questions and I
Yeah,
can
I
just
will.
respond to them.
It's not working as well as I would like.
Jeffrey, I'm
Okay,
back. I was-
okay, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Joan.
What I asked is what transpired that isn't written about that made Cain kill Abel?
Well, I mean, Joan, if I could answer that question, I would get the Nobel Prize in Biblical Studies. And I have not yet gotten that, but it's a really good question. What did transpire? I mean, we have the bare bones of the story, right? We're handed, this is with both the brilliance and the frustration of reading biblical literature. It gives you just enough material to get you to ask the questions without necessarily getting the answers. Is it that Cain is just enraged at God, enraged at his parents, and he then basically just projects that rage onto Abel because his offering isn't accepted? Maybe, maybe. I argue in my book that in fact sin, right? Remember, God sort of refers to sin almost nonchalantly as this character who's just kind of hanging out there, right? He's going to pounce on you, man. Watch out, right? Sin, I argue, actually goes to Cain and convinces Cain, you know what, Cain, Abel, right? The poor little schnook, your little brother, he's not the victim here. You're the victim. Right? We've seen that, plenty of that, right? Societies that scapegoat people who are sort of the easy, convenient ones to be victimized on the pretext that, well, you know, they're not victims, they're not weak, we're the victims, and we've got to defend ourselves, we've got to protect ourselves. So that's an argument one could make. Then in fact, Cain just decides, you know, because he's been influenced by his rage and his anger and his sadness to basically say, you know what, I got to get rid of this guy. He's doing terrible things to me, right? He's got God's attention. What about me? He's got to be destroyed. I'm doing it in self-defense. Joan, the beauty of the text is that there's no one way to understand to sort of answer your question. It could be many, many different things. Is it that Cain is just a big baby, right? Who really, you know, from the very beginning, remember something. Cain's mother, Eve, names him and says, oh, look at this. Now that I have this kid, I've acquired this child with the help of the Lord, right? Cain is very much babied by mom who loves him. Abel, right? By the way, in Hebrew, the word hevel, Abel, means wind, vapor. He's an afterthought, right? He's not even considered to be important. The guy never even talks in the story. And Cain, of course, talks plenty. Not only does he talk plenty, but God never stops talking to him. So is Cain just a big baby who can't stand the idea of sharing the spotlight with anyone? And because he never has seen the consequences, sort of the wages of murderous behavior, goes ahead and says, I'll get rid of him. Or is that he's really actually a very calculating individual? Not so clear, John, not so clear. And in some respects, I'm not even sure that it matters. Because at the end of the day, no matter what Cain's motivations are, no matter how badly we may feel for the way he feels, the story is still saying, you still don't have a right to kill your brother. Jeffrey.
Okay, I have a question from Esty. I don't see where Esty is, if you can unmute yourself. But the question is God's question, where is your brother? Wasn't presented as a question, but as a way to get Cain to think and wonder. Do you agree?
Right. That's right. Yes, very much so. You know, Esty, I think, I'm going to tell you what, I agree and I disagree. By which I mean, that's a classic rabbinic answer, by the way, right? You get to cover all the bases. You say, oh, yes, I agree, and I disagree. But think about this for a second. On the one hand, when God says to Cain, E hevel achicha, which in Hebrew means, where's your brother Abel? God is, as some of the traditional commentators tell us, trying to draw Cain in. God knows perfectly well where Abel is. He's lying there on the ground, dead. But God's got to be able to give Cain the room, as Rashi, one of the great medieval commentators, tells us. You got to give him the room to at least say, I've done a terrible thing here, and I should not have done it. On the other hand, one of the things I argue in my book is that, in fact, even God is so shocked at Cain's brazenness, at his murderous aggressiveness, that God says, where is he? Where is he? Right? A way of basically saying, what have you done here? So on the one hand, yeah, it's a rhetorical question sort of made to elicit from Cain some recognition of his behavior, right? Some sense that what he's done is wrong. On the other hand, one almost gets this sense by kind of reading the interior emotion of God, that God is just so overwhelmed with grief, with just shock that Cain has done this, that God says, where is he? Where is he? Not so clear.
Okay, and I have another question coming in from Charlotte Greenberg. If Charlotte, you're with us, maybe you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Can you hear me? I'm unmuted.
Yes.
Can you hear?
Yes.
Oh, all right. Yeah, I asked the question about why didn't God accept Cain's offering? Why was he only banished, not struck? And I'm wondering, is this an allegory for the need to have both good and evil so that this planet can make choices and become civilized and be accepted by the rest of the universe? Because I think I think there's intelligent life out there, and being intelligent, they'll have nothing to do with us.
Yeah, really.
Before you answer that, Rabbi, Charlotte, we don't see you on screen. So if you could put yourself on screen, the rabbi can actually see you as well as hear you. But go ahead, Rabbi.
There. So yeah, Charlotte, I have to tell you, my wife and I during COVID, she finally convinced me to watch lots and lots of Star Trek. Okay. And here's the interesting thing about Star Trek, right? I'm now a huge fan of Star Trek. Like, I deconstruct Star Trek in my head and in all my discussions with her. In Star Trek, it's always amazing to me. All of these other extraterrestrial life forms are smarter, sometimes nicer, sometimes better than we are. But because the whole show is anthropocentric, right? It's from the perspective of human beings. Jean-Luc Picard or Benjamin Sisko or Captain Kirk, they're always right. It doesn't matter what we did, we're always right. And you think all those guys out there sort of in the galaxies, why would they even want to talk to us? So let's go back to your question though. Does Cain remain alive ultimately because this is God's way of putting a mixed bag into the world? Maybe that's the sort of the way in which the storyteller is trying to say metaphorically, look, we're all the children of Cain, spiritually, morally, if not actually, sort of from a generational or, a demographic perspective or genetically. We're all, as it were, the children of Cain. We possess the ability, if we try, to basically overcome sin, but we're not always going to do it. There are going to be times when sin is just going to jump us and pounce on us and not let us go. So, Charlotte, I like that answer. I mean, the truth is, yeah, Cain stays out there in the story as a way of kind of serving as the symbolic foundation for humanity in general. Remember something, Abel is what? He's a hevel. What did I tell you before in Hebrew? Hevel means vapor, wind, nothing. Hevel's a nothing character. He's there and he dies, right? The only time we hear from Hevel, we hear from Abel, is when his blood cries out from the ground. I mean, think about the poetry of that. Abel's blood cries out from the ground post-mortem, and that's when you hear from Abel. Wild. But Cain, who never stops talking, and God, who never stops talking to Cain, they got to live with each other. So I don't think it's the only answer, Charlotte, but it's certainly an interesting one.
Okay, so Rachel or Lana, I'm not sure which is the right one you want to use, so you can unmute yourself and then you can ask your question.
Yeah, I was thinking that the Rabbi Orenstein is trying to tell us that what can we learn from the story, like people that are Christians have learned from the story that they
Yeah.
should do good. But I think of it as the sum of good and evil in the world remains a constant. And I'm thinking that some people want to do good, and the people who saved Jews inherently had
Yeah.
the kind of thoughts that that this was the righteous thing to do. I'm not sure that it was because they learned from their Bible what the right thing is to do.
So what do you prefer, Lana or Hannah Rachel?
Hannah.
All right. So Hannah, let me argue that in most respects, you're probably right. Most people weren't thinking about Cain and Abel. They were probably thinking about love your neighbor as yourself. And in fact, the Jews of Chambon-sur-Lignon, I think that was the town, that was the that large region in France that basically, these were all basically fundamentalist Christians. These were all essentially, assembly apostolics, evangelicals, who essentially saved the lives of thousands of Jews. When asked, when they spoke about it at all, they spoke about love your neighbor as yourself. But love your neighbor as yourself, is tied all the way back to these original stories. So I'm not going to argue that as they went out into the world, rescuers, particularly religious rescuers, but rescuers in general, were thinking, hey, this is a Cain and Abel paradigm. You couldn't prove that. We do know from the little bit of evidence that we have that some people like Imre Batori thought in those terms. And one has to extrapolate from that. I'm willing to extrapolate from that there were probably many, many other people who had absorbed that story among many other stories of biblical literature and of their religious training that said to them, sort of as a composite, right? Cain and Abel was part of a composite, which was, you don't have a right to verminize and demonize Jews, right? Even if you as a religious Christian, and there were religious Christians who believed the Jews are damned, right? You don't accept Christ as your savior. And some of the stories about priests who had very anti-Semitic attitudes and nonetheless took Jews in precisely because they realized whatever they thought about sort of the spiritual sort of status of Jews as non-Christians, they were nonetheless human beings. And ultimately, you can't allow one human being to simply take the life of another human being. So, Hannah, I'm going to argue that, as I said before, implicitly, if not necessarily explicitly, this story of Cain and Abel was part of a larger literary and spiritual inheritance for many, many people who did decide to save Jews, right? Who saw that, oh, the brother, right? The guy down the street who I see as my brother, not in the literal sense, but of course, in the figurative and the moral sense, is being treated as the other. And I'm not going to allow that to happen, right? And I'm not going to let state socialist ideologies and Nazi fascist ideologies or the local fascist ideology reconstruct my own basic sense of human responsibility. And again, what's so fascinating about the story, as I mentioned before, let's actually remember some of the questions that I asked at the end of the story. You see two very different dimensions of the Cain and Abel story that I'm willing to argue were probably very much there in people's consciousness in the back of their heads. One is your brother is not the other. Remember, what did I tell you? The text itself mentions the word ach or achicha, brother, your brother, 7 times. It's very emphatic. Bible scholars call that kind of a word, by the way, a Leitwort, which in German just means a lead word, right? This is sort of like a word that strings the story together by emphasizing over and over and over again. This is a story about what it means to be a brother or what it means to not be a brother. And the other part of the story that I think was probably implicit in people's thinking was the essential idea of freedom, right? You don't have to let sin pounce on you. At the very least, don't kill your brother. And perhaps beyond that, sort of at the very most, make sure to protect your brother from being killed. So Hannah, you're right. I don't know that we can necessarily prove, we can't prove, right, that Cain and Abel was sort of, an explicit factor in the way that people thought. But given the fact that the story is so ubiquitous and has such deep, deep roots in Western religious tradition and culture and thinking, it is no surprise that at least some rescuers did talk about the Cain and Abel story as the way in which to frame a piece of their motivation in saving Jews, much at the peril to their own lives.
Rabbi, I want to skip Kathleen. I'm going to get you in a second, but I know that Esther has to leave. So I want to get Esther Gilbert to ask her question before she has to depart. So Esther, if you can unmute.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Jeffrey. Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you for your kind words about Martin and for using the clip from the film. It was a fascinating experience to be part of that film.
I can imagine.
I just wanted to say I hadn't realized that Cain was set up. God set him up by choosing one over the other, and then going to Cain and saying, you know, I've put you in this impossible situation, and sin is at your door. So you make the choice. It wasn't exactly fair. I mean, he knew, obviously, you know, he knew that there was going to be sibling rivalry. And so it is an example, which is the whole point of it. But in a way, it's interesting. It wasn't exactly free choice.
Yeah, Esther, I have to tell you, God just doesn't come off looking too great in the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. Comes off looking real bad.
It wasn't one of his better moments.
Nah, probably not one of God's better moments. You're right. I mean, look, you know, at the core of this story is this. This is, in some respects, not even really a story about God. It's not even really a story about God's justice or God's motivations or God's righteousness or lack thereof, or, you know, sort of God's goodness and its discontents. The story at the end of the day is about Cain, because it's really a story about human beings. In other words, it's almost as if God is saying to Cain, look, buddy, I don't care if you think I was fair or unfair. I don't care if you think I set you up. I don't even care if I did set you up. At the end of the day, whatever you think about me or whatever I've done or not done, you still had no right to put your hands on Abel. You still had no right to kill him. Right. And by the way, Esther, one of the ways I know this, right, or one of the ways, sort of, I'm going to speculate here. Jews are reading the book of Genesis all around the world, right? And one of the things that the book of Genesis is all about is an attempt through all these stories about brothers and sibling rivalry to answer the question that God poses to Cain in the first place, which is, you know, where's Abel, your brother? And having to answer the question, am I my brother's keeper? And those two questions don't really get answered by the book of Genesis until the very end, in a few weeks, when Joseph and his brothers are reunited. The entire book is a book that's trying to really wrestle with this core human question, howbeit sort of within the smaller context of the early Jewish people. Are we our brothers and sisters' keepers? And so, Esther, you're right. God doesn't come off looking good here. God comes off, in some respects, one could say, right, as arbitrary, as way too mysterious, as totally sort of, as it were, you know, kind of a young, inexperienced parent unable to kind of reckon with the sort of the kind of the building rage inside of his two kids. Let's sort of push Adam and Eve out of the story, right? Adam and Eve, you know, and I ask this question in the book all the time. Adam and Eve are totally out of that story, except at the very beginning and after Abel is already dead. Only Cain and Abel and God, as it were, the kind of replacement parent, right, the surrogate parent, are there in the killing field on that plane. And at the end of the day, Cain sort of has to answer for his behavior as brother to Abel. Doesn't matter what his context is. It doesn't matter where he comes from. It doesn't matter even what the family history is or even what God did to him. At the end of the day, we can feel a sense of compassion for Cain for all those things that led to his rage. And he still had no right to kill his brother. He still had no right to kill his brother. So I don't disagree with you. God as a character, you know, just sort of, there's a lot of stuff going on there. There's a lot of not very good stuff going on there. I hope that answers the question in some respect.
Okay, Rabbi, two questions coming, but I need you to maybe change your camera has, I'm looking at your nose mostly, so maybe.
Yeah, hold on for a second. Yeah, sorry about that, guys. I'm going to sit up a little. I just want to make sure I have enough battery power. Give me 1 second. Oh, guys, would you excuse me for 1 second?
Okay.
I'm just going to put in my charger. I'll be right back. Okay.
All right. Yep. There's always technical issues. But
yeah, Technical
Okay.
issues easily resolved. Hold on for 1 second. There we go. Okay.
And Kathleen has a question for you. So Kathleen, unmute yourself and perhaps you can ask your question to Rabbi Dan.
Yes, being a Christian, I've always been taught differently about God, the Bible, etc. Like, how do one reconcile the two teachings together?
I'm not sure I understand the question, Kathleen. Which two teachings are we talking about?
Wait, the Christian teachings and Judaism teachings, because we both know that Christianity comes from Judaism. Like, how would one reconcile the two, like someone like me?
You know what? I'll tell you what. That's a question I can't answer now because it would probably take me 6 weeks. Here's what I will tell you, however, Kathleen. It's a good question. No, listen, and I'm glad that you as a thoughtful person are asking that question. I think this is what I would say. I think you don't necessarily need to reconcile them per se. You need to think about a Venn diagram. What does a Venn diagram do? And guys, I'm going to reveal my ignorance here of how Venn diagrams are used in statistical studies. A Venn diagram shows you where there are, areas of overlap, right? So I am much more concerned about sharing with Christians and sharing with Muslims and with people of no faith at all, the sort of the common stories and the common questions without worrying about the things that can't be reconciled. Where Jews and Christians and Muslims disagree, we disagree. Fortunately, we live in a pluralistic enough world where people can say, I disagree with you, but I don't have a right to hurt you or take away your rights or to denigrate you because of the fact that we disagree, right? The God we all believe in is a God who can be experienced in many different kinds of ways through different kinds of literature and practice. But let's focus on things like Cain and Abel, because these are the stories that lead all of us, Christians, Jews, Muslims, people who are atheists, agnostics, to ask big questions about the big topics, which is like things like, are we our brother's keeper? So that's my sort of very brief response to your question.
It's a great question. And Kathleen, I'm so excited that you feel comfortable and supported enough to come to these sessions. This is the second one in a row. So I really appreciate you extending yourself to want to learn about the Jewish culture. And I'm going to now go to Joanne. And Joanne, unmute yourself because you have a question that I believe is in there.
And Joanne, before you speak, just one thing, Jeffrey, let's obviously we have until about what? Probably till about 3.
Yes, 3 Eastern time. Yes.
3 Eastern time. Right. And I have to keep remembering those.
Well, you can take if you want to go back to your program. We can put more questions in and get to them later. However you want to go.
Guys, I can stay with you.
I'm here to roll. I'm a roller.
How about I'll just stay with you until 6 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. We'll just keep going. No, in all seriousness, let's take a few more questions. We'll come back to the question.
I only have one more. So Joanne,
okay, that's
the
fine.
Last one. So then you can pick it up.
Shoot away, Joanne.
You have to unmute yourself, Joanne.
We got you in, we got you unmuted.
What if it has nothing to do with?
Wait a second, Joan. Joanne, it's Joanne Gilbert. Go ahead, is next, and then I can get to you, Joan.
Right. Never mind.
Thank you. It's not so much a question as one of the epiphanies I've been having during your wonderful talk. And it seems to me that, as Esther Gilbert said, it was a setup, albeit a fable setup. And to me, it is evocative of what the Brits have done throughout their empire. If you look at India, if you look at Ireland, if you look at the Middle East, everywhere they went, they set up the indigenous people to hate each other. And then when the Brits, withdrew, they left chaos and murder and horrific circumstances that carry on forever. So that was an epiphany I wanted to share rather than a question.
So God is the original colonialist
yes.
occupier.
Yeah, and as you also mentioned, he screwed up a lot then because he was maybe an adolescent at being God in the chronology of fables.
Yeah, and I have to tell you this, and I'm glad that Esther asked her question, Joanne, that she said what she said. I want to come back to. I think you guys already realize we've only been learning together for an hour. I'm not interested in sort of how do I put this? In sort of pietizing the text. In other words, the text does not need to be some reflection of, of pure pious dogma. These are rough and tumble texts about God and humans, for God's sakes. These are the stories. I can't tell you how much I love studying this stuff with you guys, with any group of people, precisely because of the fact that whether we're talking about rescuers or we're not talking about rescuers, these are the stories that dig into the heart of what it means to be a human being, at least from the perspective of one Western writer. Now, remember, there are lots of other religions and people and stories out there about siblings and brothers and peace and war and sex and a million different kinds of things. But a story like this one calls so many questions forward about human responsibility, about families, about the natural state of families, about God. Esther, thank you for asking those questions again about the setup sort of that God constructs here, because that's what we should be asking. There should be no question that's too tender, right, or too sensitive to ask. This is what, and by the way, remember something. I come out of the rabbinic Jewish tradition, okay? I can't speak for Christians. I can't speak for Muslims. I can only speak for me. I can only speak for the Jewish tradition. This is what rabbis have been doing for, not just rabbis, people have been doing for thousands of years. That's how these stories have lasted, folks. They are so skeletal and so, what's the word I'm looking for? They're so irritating in some respects, in a good way, that they force you to ask more questions than you can get answers for. And what allows us to thrive as a human community, as people of faith or of no faith, is that we can sit together as human beings and ask the questions. That's what these stories are about more than anything else. So please hack away at God. As one of my teachers, Professor Burton Vysotsky at the Jewish Theological Seminary, some of you may have learned with him or studied with him. Bert has been one of my teachers of Midrash, right, of rabbinic interpretation for many, many years, since I was a very, very young man. And I remember when I was around 14, I was in a Bible class with him in high school, and he wasn't yet an ordained rabbi. Now he's now sort of moving into sort of retirement after many years of academia and everything else. And I said to him, we were studying some very tough stuff about the Bible and about God. And I said, Bert, doesn't this sort of like insult God? And he looked at me and he said, Mr. Orenstein, and I was all of 15. He said, God is a big boy. He can take it. Think about that. In other words, this text belongs to us, not just Jews, humans. Sit down, read the text. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to ask those questions. Anyway, that's my soapbox about Bible study. Goodbye.
So Rabbi, I want to just understand, or you want to continue, or do we want to have a question from Joan? Joan has a comment.
All right, Joan. So let's sort of finish up with Joan, and then we're going to go back and do a little bit more of the of the rescuer stuff, because I want to show you this really interesting clip from Michael King's Rescuers. It's just amazing stuff. Sure, Joan.
Sorry, it's my dog.
All right.
I was wondering, what if it doesn't have to do with being a brother's keeper, and it has to do with empathy and the fact that some Christians and Jews had good relationships and they felt for their neighbors and they wanted to help them, and they didn't think about, am I my brother's keeper?
So Joan, let me make the suggestion that in fact, that is what empathy is, right? That in some respects, what empathy is recognizing I am my brother's keeper because I know what I would want my brother to do for me if I were on the other side of the coin. And so, the notion of brother's keeper is this kind of, it feels almost like a kind of abstract notion of justice, right? It doesn't matter if you feel for the person, doesn't matter if you sort of even like the person, you might even hate the person, you still have a responsibility to treat that person with decency. I'm willing to argue that in fact, that intersects with the notion of empathy, right? Now, that's not to say that everybody is going to sort of allow that to kind of emerge in the way that they behave, or to allow to emerge far enough so that they're willing to say, I'm willing to save that brother's life, even at the risk to my own. My understanding, and I have to tell you folks, I just haven't yet been able to find the entire film. I haven't watched all of Rescuers yet. Amazon Prime still doesn't, for whatever reason, they don't have it streaming, whatever, whatever. I'll see the whole thing at some point. But one of the questions that Sir Martin Gilbert keeps asking his young student from Rwanda, I keep forgetting her name, who's with him, who's an anti-genocide activist, is, can we not believe that there's an inherent goodness to human beings, right? Which of course incorporates empathy, incorporates perspective, incorporates a sense of brotherhood, that this isn't just about how, that sort of, sin is always crouching at the door. What if there's something else crouching at the door, which is this ability to say, I will not allow myself to behave the way that you are behaving, which is this ability to say, I see this person and I want to help this person because it's the right thing to do. We're so quick to talk about the inherent evil potential of human beings. Maybe part of what Cain and Abel is doing in its own rather dour or rather dire way is saying, you know what? When you dig deep enough, there is a capacity, at least a potential, for goodness as well. Right? So, Joan, I would not distinguish the two. I would actually say to you that, I'm not going to sort of play psychologist here. I mean, empathy is a complex concept of personality, but that I really believe that it really does intersect with this notion of a sense of shared brotherhood, right? When I feel a sense of empathy for someone else, I'm able to step into that person's shoes so that, I'm able to see that person as a real human being. As you'll see with some of the stories about rescuers, we'll study a little bit more about Batory, but we also want to look at Tulkuman's story, which is just fascinating, really, really fascinating. I hope that answers the question. I hope it answers the question.
All right, Rabbi, go ahead.
All right, so folks, let's do this. We're going to look at one clip. It's about 6 minutes long. And again, I must tell you, I really think that Michael King did a magnificent job. The clips I've been looking at on the Facing History and Ourselves websites, and there's 5 of them, give you just this rich, rich sense. Esther, I'd love to hear the story about how this thing got put together. It must be an amazing story. Just amazing. Watch this clip, folks, and then I'm going to read for you what Tulkuman's son said. I believe the speech that I got off of the Facing History website was actually the acceptance speech that he read, that he delivered at Yad Vashem when they honored his dad posthumously as a as a Hasid Umot Olam, right, as one of the righteous of the world. So let's take a look. And hold on for a second. Give me 1 sec. I want to make sure that I have it here. Rescuer Inroads. All right, folks. Now remember, when you screen share video, it's not, sometimes it kind of slows down, but we'll do our best here. Okay. So here we go. All right, give me 1 sec. And let's go. You all hear it?
The island of Rhodes, whose Jewish community of some 2,000 souls lived in fear and trembling that they would be deported. So many Greeks had been murdered in cruel reprisals. So many of the villages had been burnt to the ground by the SS occupation forces. Selahattin Ulkume, a Muslim who managed to save the Jews of Rhodes because he was able either to give them Turkish citizenship because they'd been born in Turkey, or to prevail upon the German authorities to accept them as Turkish citizens because they were married to someone who had a Turkish passport. Very good to meet you.
Very good to meet you so much.
Well,
This is
the modern Turkish consulate.
That's right. Yes. This is the modern Turkish consulate.
They did take my father into a building where they were taking all the men. Yes, but not the women and children yet. And we took 3 days, I think, to present themselves.
We were standing online, and Mr. Ulkuman came out, and he said, "You go home with your children," to my mother. He said, "I will try to rescue your father as well." And he demanded that the Jewish Turkish citizens be released and that they had the same protection as any other Turkish citizens. He was able to rescue my father who was not a Turkish citizen, like my mother was. And my mother maintained dual citizenship and also maintained dual citizenship for Elliot and myself. And as I told you, and I reminded you when we met in Washington, D.C., that our lives and our family is there because of your father.
God bless you and your children and your family.
I remember thinking what an extraordinarily brave man he was to have confronted the Germans. Of course, Turkey was neutral, but the Germans had overwhelming power on the island and an overwhelming determination to deport the Jews.
My father was a young diplomat and came here together with my mother in 1943. My father was told over and over again to stop giving these passports and helping the Jewish community escape the island from Rhodes to Marmaris on the Turkish coast. It was the 18th of February, 1944. My mother was upstairs in the residence writing letters to her mother and to her sister, and she was nursing a cold. And at that very moment, two planes came and flew over the consulate. Thereafter, the planes made a tour and passed over again, flying very close over the roofs.
German planes. We need to go.
My mother was thrown to the ground and she was unconscious. When she came to herself, she saw nothing but dust and rubble. Her mate was lying dead only a few feet away from her. And my father called out, Mihri Nisa, that's my mother's name. There was no answer, so he became almost hysterical. He ran into the rubble. And he pulled her out and carried her to the hospital, but the Germans had strict instructions not to allow them. So fortunately, he knew some doctors on the island. He took my mother to their house and they took care of her wounds. She somehow knew that she was carrying a boy, that was me. So my father spoke with the doctors and they said, well, we will try to save, of course, both the patient and the baby. So I was born on a Saturday and she died the following Saturday. After the bombing of the consulate, some papers in Turkey flashed news saying Turkish consul and wife killed. And at the time, my grandmother, my mother's mother, read these news and nobody could prove her that my mother was still alive. And 3 days later, she committed suicide. She shot herself.
What a terrible series of tragedies.
Yes.
And all happening to someone who had done such incredibly good things to save Jews from here in Rhodes by making sure they were protected by Turkey.
That's right. But my father said it is one man's duty to help his brother. They were my brother, so it was my duty to come to their assistance because I was in a position to do so.
He and his wife were determined, without the ability to contact his superiors, to help as many people as they could from the German clutches.
I used to ask him, I said, Father, look, don't you regret what you have done? You lost your dear wife, you lost your mother-in-law, and look at all the tragedy. And he would say to me, if I were to relive my life, I would behave exactly the way I did it. I have no regrets. And I know your mother would want the same thing, would want me to do the same thing. That's what he was saying.
Just an amazing, amazing story. An amazing story. And I want to read to you something that Mehmet Ulkumen said about his father. Again, this was at the acceptance sort of speech that he did at Yad Vashem. Let me screen share that with you for just a second, folks. We'll take a look at what he wrote. Hold on for a second. We'll come back to our questions. Oh, we never even got to Dan Pagis. Maybe we'll do that at the end. We'll see. We'll see. It's an amazing poem that I want you guys to read. So we've just watched this excerpt about Slachatin Ulkumen, and let's look at what Mehmet said about his father in the acceptance speech at Yad Vashem. How does he start this? Now think about this. So it's remember, I'm trying to remember who asked the question before. I think maybe it was Hannah who asked the question about, can we really say that folks were sort of, kind of, motivated in some kind of an explicit way, by sort of, by these stories of the Bible? Were they not just basically motivated by a sense of decency? Which, of course, the answer is yes. Of course, they were motivated by a sense of decency. And yet, remember, the context of decency is, decency doesn't happen out of nowhere, right? Decency is something which is sometimes inherent. Most of the time, it has to be learned. And so what's the context of learning decency? Where did Ulkumen, right, who was a person who both had tremendous power to do good and was also at tremendous risk because of the fact that he was running the consulate, where did that sense of decency where did it come from for him as a Turkish Muslim, right, in a position of political power and political vulnerability as well? And by the way, folks, do remember the following. The story of Cain and Abel, there is a version of the story of Cain and Abel in Quran, right? In Islamic teaching. It's called Habil and Kabil, and I don't remember exactly which surah it is. It's found in the Quran. It is it's an early sort of Quranic version of the original biblical story, which is all about brothers killing brothers. So watch how Mehmet Ulkumen, Ulkumen starts the story, starts the acceptance. And the Lord asked, "Where is your dear brother?" And Cain answered, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? Am I my brother's keeper?" This is a question that has plagued humanity since the beginning of time. Yet perhaps there was no greater moment in history to ask and answer that question than during World War II, when in a quest for religious and racial purity, more than 10 million people, Jews and others, were sent to their deaths. Men, women, children, young and old, murdered simply because of their faith and their ethnicity. The river of death destroyed homes simply because of their faith and their ethnicity. The river of death destroyed homes, villages, and nations. Yet much of mankind simply stood by and watched these suffering people being swallowed up by the waters of hatred and cruelty. My father, Slachatin Ulkumen, and my mother, Michrinisa, were witnesses to part of this great tragedy unfolding before their eyes on the island of Rhodes toward the end of World War II. They saw the betrayal of God, the treachery of man, and the fall of humanity. They also saw how man could kill his own neighbor simply because he was different. They also realized how it was possible for people to close their eyes to the truth because of their own hatred, cowardice, or simply their indifference. My father could not simply stand by and watch. He did not close his eyes, nor did he acquiesce in the hatred or indifference which existed. Instead, with my mother's continuous support, he stood up, not as a hero, not as a diplomat, not as a Muslim nor a Turk, but rather as a man, answering God's call to protect his brother, call that would later claim the life of the dearest person to him, my mother. Incredibly powerful words. Here, Mehmet Ulkumen takes all this framework of Cain and Abel, the betrayal of God, the betrayal by one human being of another human being, this notion of human fraternal responsibility, and weaves together an explanation of his father's actions, which he, not as a young man, right? This is not a little boy thinking about these things anymore. This is a fully grown, mature human being trying to understand what would have motivated his father to have done this in the first place. And what's so interesting to me, folks, I'm going to take this off of, I'm just going to take this off of the share for just a second. What's so fascinating to me, what just absolutely amazes me, is that you take a story like this, a man like Slachatin Ulkumen and a man like Imre Batori. These are two men who never would have met, living in two radically different places in Europe at the time. One is a celebrated diplomat. This is a man who potentially has tremendous political power. Look at what he does. He is able to basically get all these Jews included, even those sort of, the ones who have no clue whatsoever that they could have ever been thought of as Turkish citizens. He manages to basically do what people like Sugihara and Wallenberg had done, which was essentially by hook or by crook to create a reality of citizenship for them so that he could say to the German authorities, you can't touch these people. These people belong to my government. At the same time, with all that power, with all that influence and that prestige and all of that sort of, really think about it, just, real sharp, savvy and acumen, to be at such incredible risk, because this is a man who was so public, so exposed and so vulnerable that ultimately the Germans murdered his wife by basically, what did they do? They shot at and blew up, the consulate to basically make it very clear, you better stop doing this now. And then you take somebody like Imre Batori, simple farmer, deeply motivated by religious feeling, deeply motivated by a sense of, this is my brother, and I don't want to be called to account before the heavenly tribunal, which will say, why did you decide to do things like Cain and not listen to your brother's cry, the cry of your brother's blood? Two people completely different in two completely different circumstances, completely different religions, different classes, different levels of professional achievement. Batori was basically a simple farmer who nobody, no one would have known him. And yet he went ahead and he did what he did, which was to save Martin Wiesel and 4 members of his family. And he did it for many years, by the way. And both of them, whether they spoke about their experience or, as in the case of Ulkumen, their children spoke about the experience, used the Cain and Abel, the language of Cain and Abel, right? Sort of the common cultural referent of the Cain and Abel story and the consciousness emerging from it to basically frame in part why they did what they did. Why they did what they did. So folks, listen, let me stop for a second. Jeffrey, do we have other questions, other stuff that
yeah, Solly, you wanted to ask a question. Please unmute yourself.
There you go.
Okay. Basically, my parents were both survivors of Auschwitz and the death marches to Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald. God bless the rescuers who saved them at that inhumane period in history. How about the survivors' ability to overcome the huge losses and continue to survive? My mom found a brother in someone whose way of life was not righteousness. The Talmud states that someone who saves a life saves the world.
Mm-hmm.
Does the righteousness of someone whose previous actions are not righteous affect the way God perceives this?
Oy, Saul, I don't know what to do with that one. That's a very small question. In fact, that question is so minor, I'm going to have Jeffrey answer it.
No, you're not.
Look, it's interesting. I was just studying this morning, Saul, with one of my Torah study, a friend of mine, a colleague. We study Hasidic literature together, and one of the things we were talking about was, does the ability of a person who wants to do better, right, who wants to do what Jews call teshuvah, does that person, the way it was framed by this particular writer was, does that person who wants to do better and wants to come back to God and wants to sort of, accept responsibility for bad behavior, if God were to simply say to that person, I'm really sorry, but I'm going to beat you over the head with this, that person would never be able to do it. And so, at least according to this one particular Hasidic master, God gives that person the room to come back in a way that other people who are much more righteous would not have an opportunity to do, because it gives that person room to actually feel a part of things again. But you're asking a different question. I'm going to step off from that. You're asking the question about, let's take somebody like Schindler, okay? And I'm not just talking about sort of the popularized Schindler from Keneally's book and from the Spielberg film. We know that Schindler was not one of the nicer men in Europe, right? This is a man, a lot of problems. He did a lot of very, very not nice things. He was a war profiteer, for God's sakes. And so think about it this way, and I'm going to sort of use a Kabbalistic concept here for a second, okay? We're going to use a sort of a Jewish mystical concept. Schindler was able to use his conniving sneakiness, his ability to game the system, his total lack of, what was he doing? He was looking to basically, claiming at least, that he was basically trying to run factories during the war because he was basically in bed with the Germans and being paid by the Germans a lot of money to build stuff so that, the Wehrmacht could do what it did, okay? And yet he was able to use all of that stuff and transform it ultimately, Saul, into a force for good. So the Kabbalists, right, the sort of the ancient Jewish mystics have a term for this in Hebrew. It's called hamtakat hadinim b'shorashehem. Hamtakat hadinim b'shorashehem means sweetening the forces of evil at the root, which is their very poetic way of saying, you take the crappy stuff that you've done or that exists, and instead of sitting there and trying to pretend that it never existed, you transform it into something which can be used for good. Now, even before there were Kabbalists and mystics and everybody else, we had a Bible, which thousands of years before them said something similar, but didn't really say it in philosophical terms. And what does the Bible say? The Bible basically shows us, and we're reading these stories now in the book of Genesis, Jews are reading these stories in the book of Genesis, who, the Bible basically shows us stories of people who are less than perfect, truly less than perfect, who as broken vessels, right? These are broken people. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Rebecca, Sarah, Rachel, Leah, all of these guys have their brokenness like every human being. But what they do with that brokenness is ultimately serve as a vessel for God's love and compassion and mercy and justice. They go out into the world in their brokenness, not as perfect people, but as the people that they are, and they manage to take that brokenness and use it to transform the world, even if they're not necessarily transforming themselves, right? Good example. A couple of weeks we're going to read about the story of Jacob. Remember Jacob, grandson of Abraham, right? He's a jerk. I'm sorry, guys. I don't care what my ancestors, the rabbis of the Talmud, say about him. You read the text. He's a jerk. He's a horrible human being in some respects. And he's got to get himself kicked in the teeth over and over and over again over a 20-year period to learn how much of a jerk he really was towards his brother, his mother, his father, everybody else. He grows. Not perfect, right? This is not some Greek myth. And so, Saul, I would say this, that ultimately, is there redemption or salvation, as it were? I even hate using that term because it's really not a Jewish term. But ultimately, is there some sense of redemption for people who were not particularly good? Well, yeah, and I think that the way the Jews have always understood that is that, the way in which you redeem yourself a lot of the time from the evil that you've done is by starting out by doing good, right? Using those tools or using who you are to sort of, again, to sweeten the forces of judgment and evil at the root, to sort of take it and transform it into something that can be used for good. Clearly, we know that there were rescuers who definitely did that, okay? We know, probably the best example of this, and again, some of it is just kind of shrouded in mythology. We understand that, but much of it is also historically rooted. And that, of course, is Schindler. Oskar Schindler was well known for being a philanderer and a war profiteer and a liar. He knew Nazis. I think he was a member of the Nazi Party. A lot of people were members of the Nazi Party. Schindler had that moment where he realized, oh my God, look at what my buddies, the Nazis, are doing. This will not stand. And so what does he do? He takes all that stuff, right? All that accumulated political capital that he has with the Nazis to do what? To basically, under their noses, save 1,200 Jews. It's huge. So, Saul, I think I hope I answered your question, which is
no, yeah. I kol hakavod. You definitely did. Obviously you're a biblical scholar, and you were able to put it into the proper perspective.
Saul, to kind of paraphrase the old joke, I'm not a Bible scholar, but I do play one on TV.
Kol hakavod.
Very
And Jeffrey's
good.
saying here, Jeffrey's saying to Rabbi Dan's point, I recommend a film on Amazon Prime called In Darkness. What is that film about?
That's just what you're talking about. Here is a guy who in the Lvov ghetto profited on the Jews that he was saving.
Yeah.
And then eventually he turned to love the Jews that he was saving.
Yeah.
And he became one of the righteous among nations in Yad Vashem. So
right.
It's a really good movie. I recommend it to anybody who's, and this parallels what you're saying.
Yeah. No, I'm
But it's not as famous as Schindler's List.
Right. I mean, Schindler became famous because of Spielberg and because Thomas Keneally wrote a really wonderful novelistic description of his life. Yeah, but there are lots of these stories. And so the two stories that I showed you, of course, Sal, are two stories about two select individuals who we can say implicitly, if not explicitly, were motivated by not even necessarily the story of Cain and Abel, but kind of the ethos of Cain and Abel, which is you are free to tangle with sin. You do not have to do bad. You do not have to countenance evil. And you are your brother's keeper, right? That's sort of floating around in people's cultural consciousness all over Europe. Not too many people are going to sort of act on it. A lot of people are going to say, very nice Bible story. I'm going to wait and protect my family, or I'm going to join, the Nazi party, and, because those Jews are all vermin anyway. The very same. Look, remember, Hannah Arendt, and believe me, I'm not a big fan of Hannah Arendt, okay? But one of the things that I think that she said that was incredibly insightful was when she talked about the banality of evil in Eichmann in Jerusalem, right? A very controversial book in the 20th century. Arendt says this so powerfully. She says, think of who these guys were. You think that these guys were basically these horrible, evil monsters roaming around the earth? These guys, by day, were murdering Jews in the camps, and by night, we're going back and being nice husbands and nice mommies and daddies and nice wives and playing piano and doing all the nice things that people do. That you met them on the street, you say, oh, it's a nice family. Right? Such was the banality of evil, which, by the way, that whole notion starts as early as what? As Cain and Abel, right? The capacity to do evil to your brother starts with Cain and Abel, the two brothers who were the founders of the world. Nothing magic about it, right? There's nothing mystical about it. The Bible is saying, and later writers on the Bible are saying, it's just there, right? It's the banality of Cain-like evil, which is scary. It's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying. All the more reason why you have to keep thinking about the story and saying, what does it mean to truly be your brother's keeper, your sister's keeper?
Rabbi.
Yeah.
With all due respect to you, your parents have a question for you. And I don't want to keep them waiting. So if you can ask the question, unmute yourself.
Do I call them Rabbi Dan or just Dan?
Just please.
Tell him whatever you want to call him. He'll bark.
Listen, he paid for rabbinical school, so he gets to call me whatever he wants.
Through the nose.
Anyway, go ahead.
Daniel, I heard you before, and I keep thinking about the characters, Cain and Abel. Cain, in my mind, is a vacuous individual. He doesn't conceptualize the whole idea of he came out of the same womb with his brother.
Yeah.
Disavows that. And yet, I in my mind, as I was thinking about that idea, I fast forwarded a couple of thousand years to a particular song and a particular situation. The song I remembered from How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying. That the last song in the show was The Brotherhood of Man, okay, which takes in a much more broader picture. And then I thought of Father Flanagan, where he ain't heavy, Father, he's my brother.
Yeah.
And I'm saying to myself, the character who is saying he ain't heavy as he lifts him up is not of the flesh and blood of the same womb. He is lifting up humanity in that sense. He ain't heavy, Father, he's my brother. He's my brother because brother, in the societal sense of view, is everyone, every man, every woman. It's not a question, it was just sort of two or three things that popped into my head.
So if I can ask a question, Rabbi, perhaps you can, your parents lived in Albany?
No, they live in Queens. They live in Queens, the center of the world.
Okay.
In the good part of Queens.
They live in Queens. They live in Queens.
Okay.
No, I'm the only one who lives in Albany. Dad, look, this idea about the brotherhood, I mean, I want folks to remember this. And remember, it's not, biblical literature or the literature of the major Western religions, however secular people have become, right? And that's not so clear. You'd have to do a global study of Jews, Christians, and Muslims to really see how secularized, billions of people have become. But for all of the process of Westernization and secularization, a process, by the way, which is often threatened by all sorts of, terrible backlashes to basic concepts of democracy and freedom and things like that. For all of that, remember that these are stories, right? And a story doesn't exist suspended in kind of some kind of colloidal suspension. You study a story like Cain and Abel, you're not just studying the story, you're studying the story and all the connections, emotional, psychological, moral, political, that have been made about that story by the people within whose community you live. And so a man by Sulata Tulkumen or Imre Batori, living in radically different circumstances during the war, can take a story like that, or can take sort of the cultural consciousness that a story like that articulates, and can make it a part of who they are, even as, and especially as, they are struggling against that all too common tendency of human beings to have no interest whatsoever in the brotherhood of man or in the brotherhood of humanity. That's the brilliance of Cain and Abel, is that it's basically offering us two very different perspectives. One is, Cain, you have an opportunity here to do what God needs you to do in terms of treating your brother with a sense of responsibility. And then the other perspective, which is, I ain't gonna do it. I hate them. I'm gonna kill them. That's the brilliance of the story. It forces us to constantly look at both of those poles, to look at both of those dimensions of the human experience and of human effort, and to say, what are we gonna choose? Tulkumen made a choice. Imre Batori made a choice. Wallenberg, Sugihara, all of these people ultimately decided not to let sin jump them. Now, again, remember, the Bible, when it says that, means, it really just means sort of initially, it means don't let someone else do evil to you, right? Cause you to do evil, right? They went one step further, which was, not only am I not going to do evil to these people, I'm going to stop other evil people from doing evil to those people. Amazing. How did they get there? I'd like to believe that implicitly, if not explicitly, as I've said to you many times before, it was this deepened consciousness that we owe each other something, that the Jew next door isn't the Jew, he's a human being. He is your brother, and you have a responsibility. I mean, imagine what that took for them to do. My wife and I have this conversation all the time, as because my mother-in-law, I think, is still on the call. I'm not sure that Rosalie is on the call. Oh, there she is. My wife has done a lot of study about the Shoah and about the Holocaust, because my mother-in-law's family, came from Germany in the 1930s. They were running. Hi, Mom. That's my mother. That's Rosalie. Hi. And one of the things that Marianne and I talk about all the time is, I always say, well, I know that if right now, today, the fascists were marching in the streets, I would be able to, you and I, honey, at 105 Colonial Avenue in Albany, we would take in as many people as possible. And she looks at me and she kind of laughs and she says, you have no idea what you would do. You have no clue what you would do. You hope you would do that, but you don't know. Right? And imagine, take that now, right? And take it all the way back to the beginning, to sort of the mythic beginnings of humanity, where God essentially is saying to Cain, look, you have a choice here. What are you going to do with it? I would hope that my choice would be to rescue Abel and not to go along with the crowd and let him die. I would hope, you know, I would hope that we would be able to find a place in our basement, or in, you know, our kids are now all adults and moved out, you know, we'd be able to, you know, hide people. I hope, but I don't know. And so that makes what these guys did, all of them, but particularly the two that I talked about today, motivated as they were by this sense, this deep core sense of brotherhood, motivated to basically say, he's my brother, right? He's not the Jew. He ain't heavy. He's my brother. And that means no matter how distant from him I am, culturally or in terms of consciousness or anything else, I have no choice but to save his life. Amazing.
Dan,
yeah.
I want to just give you a time check. It's 20 of 12. So I know you have a couple other clips that you want to provide. Is that true?
You know what? No, let me do this for you guys.
Right.
Do you want to end this? Would you like to end this, I hope, inspirational conversation that we had with a little bit of a downer?
No, not yet. Not yet. But I want to have Rosalie, if you don't mind unmuting yourself, I want to introduce you and then say hello to you. So
Rosalie Alexander.
Rosalie Alexander. It's nice to meet you. Say hello to your son-in-law, which is always amazing to do on Zoom. Where are you located? I'm sorry, say again.
Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia.
I used to be living in Allentown.
Fine place.
Up here, Myra.
A fine place.
And so how's he doing? I just wanted to make sure that he got a critique from you.
She's not going to tell you now.
Okay, I wanted to ask, I haven't asked you prior to, but you have presented the materials that you did today. They're definitely in a Word doc. Are you okay with people, if they're interested, receiving that? Okay. Absolutely. So I want you to do me a favor, if you can. I'm going to put my email address online in the chat. And if you want the attachment or the presentation materials that Rabbi has sent, just send me an email. I'll be happy to forward it to you. I'm going to put my email right here, right now. And Dan, I'll turn it right back to you. Whatever story you want to do, but don't leave us with a downer.
No, I'm not going to leave you down. It's all right. I'm not going to do that. Here's what I'm going to do, folks. You know, the one thing I didn't do with you today was read with you Don Pagis's poem, which is a very powerful poem. Go and read it yourselves. It's called Written in Pencil in the Boxcar, or something like that. You'll find it online. It's an amazing poem. Stephen Mitchell, Can you
put the name in chat so everyone can see
Actually,
it?
you know what? Let me show it to you guys very, very quickly. Hold on for a second. Give me a second. Here we go. Here, I'm going to show you the poem. Here, we'll just read it very, very quickly. We're not going to discuss it right now. It's called Written in Pencil in the Sealed Railway Car by Pagis. Here in this carload, I am Eve with Abel, my son. If you see my other son, Cain, son of man, tell him that and that's the end of the poem. That's the end of the poem. It's a very, very powerful poem. It figures prominently in a number of different places at Yad Vashem. Pagis, again, was a Holocaust survivor, in addition to being a magnificent. I'm hearing echo.
Yeah, I'm gonna mute everyone. So hold on a second.
Okay. There we go. Okay. So, folks, go back and you can find it. It's very easy to find online. Lots and lots of people have commented on the poem. It is a brilliant piece of literature. I think we still need to get a couple of people muted there. There we go. Okay. Just a brilliant, brilliant poem that takes the Cain and Abel story and essentially literally transports it or transfers it into a sealed boxcar as Eve, right, with Abel, is riding along on the tracks to her death in a death camp. I mean, imagine the image of that. Just amazing. But let's actually finish on something a little bit more positive, okay? And then, folks, I am going to make one request of you. Okay, so let's take a look. I told you again, I talked about Eva Fogelman's Conscience and Courage. This is what she says at the very beginning of the book. These men, women, and children who risked their lives to save others were flesh and blood human beings with strengths and faults. Yet they saw people who were different from them and responded not to their difference, but to their similarities. While most people saw Jews as pariahs, rescuers saw them as human beings. They recognized that for many Jews, the choice made by a bystander could mean life or death. And then she continues on in the rest of the book. So, Jeffrey, if I can just say a couple of final things, and then
I want to, before you do,
Yep.
I want to really, this was such an amazingly educational and informative session.
Glad you enjoyed it, guys.
And I really so appreciate your efforts. I want to recommend that all of you get his hold on. All of you get Dan's book. It's on Amazon. It's Cain and Abel. And I think the read is terrific. All of you are all of you have, I think, are into this topic, and you've provided Dan some tremendous insights that I never thought of before as I interpreted that Cain and Abel story for myself. So, you know, Dan appears in front of us without any cost or any stipends. So I also want to thank you for doing that.
My pleasure.
And, you know, I know we will cross paths again in the programming at some point. You have more than just Cain and Abel to tell us about. So we're so appreciative. I'm going to hand it back to you. You can go, you can do whatever you'd want to do with the remaining program.
Very, very quickly. Thank you. Listen, folks, just thank you to Jeffrey again for sort of, you know, inspiring all of us and for doing this program. Guys, in addition, I'd love you to buy the book. Please buy the book. Buy 1,000 copies, you know, for Hanukkah. Give them out to your friends. It'll be very nice. My publisher will be very happy about it. The other thing is, folks, I'm happy to speak. I don't charge. You know, I got a job. Okay, I got 2 jobs. This is a labor of love for me, and I'm happy to speak to other groups. It's an inspiration for me. Hopefully it's great teaching for other people, and it opens the dialogue that we so sorely need as the human race right now. So please, you want to bring me into your synagogue, your church, your whatever, your JCC, I'm happy to do this. And you know what? I mean, very few good things came out of COVID. It was a horrible time. It continues to be a horrible time for us. But one of the good things was that we learned how to use this kind of technology so we can all come together as if we were all sitting together in the same room, and we're stretched out across 3 different time zones, which is an amazing thing. So please, if you'd like me to come and speak to whatever group you're working with, I'm happy to do it. Jeffrey knows how to get in touch with me. You can easily find me on Facebook. I'll tell you what I'm going to do, Jeffrey. This is what I'm going to do. I'm just going to very quickly, just give you my email. It's easy enough to remember.
While you type and talk at the same time, I'm going to ask you a question.
Sure.
You answered it for some earlier, but how long have you been working on your book, Cain and Abel?
So I worked on the book actively for 5 years. It took me 5 years. As I mentioned at the very beginning, I was very lucky that I have a synagogue that really values my intellectual and my creative work. And, you know, I feel very blessed by the fact that folks give me the room and the time to do this, which is really a very, very big thing. So I've been studying and thinking about Cain and Abel for years and years and years, but the active writing was from 2015 to 2020.
And we have a lot of people who are creative in our audience. Some of them have written books. Some of them are thinking about writing books.
Yeah.
You've written a book, which you've done something that is exceptional. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit about your process, and perhaps you can tell us a little bit about the publisher, because it was very intriguing to me to hear that your publisher was sort of giving you one chapter to eat at a time. And then all of a sudden, when you had 5 chapters, he said, you have a book. I think that resource would be helpful for other people who have stories about their parents, stories that are unique. So please share your creative process with us a little bit.
And before I do that, just very briefly, because I don't think that I mentioned it clearly enough at the very beginning of our program, I should also just acknowledge the presence of my other beloved family members. My mother-in-law is here, my parents are here, my aunt and uncle Alan and Selma Aronson are here, and my uncle Sandy Schumann is here as well. So I'm glad. Thanks, guys, for coming on and
Well,
support on there.
if you can show us your pictures, we'll be able to see you, which would be great. So just show us your video, take your video off and make it on, and then we can see you.
So as you guys are doing that, those of you who choose to do it, let me tell you a little bit about my process. As Jeffrey said, good to see you guys. Oh my God, I'm forgetting his name, the head of JPS, Barry Schwartz. When I got in touch with Barry, about 5-6 years ago, I said to him, I have this idea. He said, great, show me what you have. I showed him a couple of chapters. And I remember, so folks, I'm writing essays and sermons all the time. And I see sermons really as opportunities for essay writing. My teachers have always told me, any sermons.
Rabbi Dan.
Hold on for 1 second.
Sorry, Dan.
That's okay. That's okay. Moshe, if you have a question, I'll get to you in 1 sec. You may want to mute just.
Yes, Rabbi San.
So, one of the things
that I want to pass on.
Yeah, 1 second, Moshe. If I'm just going to make one comment, and then we'll get a comment from you as well, if that's okay.
Okay, all right.
All right. So 1 sec. Hold on for 1 sec. Thank you. My teachers have always said to me, any sermon that you write, you should be able to use in 3 different venues. So I will often write a sermon and then I'll pass it along to Northeast Public Radio, or I'll send it off to Times of Israel. I'd love to be writing at other venues, but that's sort of where I am right now. Or I turned it into an essay. I just got an extended essay accepted by a journal, which was 10 years in the making, right? Just sort of playing it back and forth. It got rejected by a couple of places. It pushed me to kind of improve it. My writing process is this, and everybody's writing process is different, folks. I don't know how many of you are looking to write, how many of you do write, how many of you have written a book or are thinking about writing a book or an article, whatever it is. A lot of writing teachers will tell you, put everything together in an outline first. I can't do it. It doesn't work. It kills me. I just sort of got to let it flow. And what I really need is I need a lot of quiet. When I go on a lot of retreats, a lot of people, they go skiing. I go to Catholic retreat centers, and I sit at Catholic retreat centers, are the best retreat centers in the world. And I sit there and I think, and I just let it roll. I let it go. And then look, the nice thing about working off of a laptop is you can sort of, as you're in the mode, you can basically sort of sit there and you can kind of play with it. And you can kind of make the corrections that you want, and you can think, and then you can come back. There are times when I'll expend so much energy in the writing, I'll fall asleep. And then I wake up, and you know what happens? Your brain gets clear. Whatever it is that happens during sleep or REM sleep, you often are able to resolve creative or personal issues just because there's stuff going on in your brain that allows you to move kind of forward in your own personal dialogue. So Jeffrey, the simplest way I can say it is I don't do a whole lot of, I'll do a lot of reading, I'll do a lot of research, I'll do a lot of planning in terms of thinking and reading, but often what will happen is I'll sit down when I really feel like I'm ready and I just start to write. And often what I will find is that stuff that I had a conversation about with my wife or one of my middle school students or a congregant or a colleague 6 months earlier, poof, it suddenly comes back and it starts making connections and I start writing whatever I'm writing.
Talk us about the publisher.
Oh, so the publisher is Jewish Publication Society in my mother-in-law's hometown in Philadelphia. JPS has been around, what we say, it's like 130 years now. It's been around a long, long time. The Jewish Publication Society is a major publisher of the Jewish Publication Society Bible, right? The Tanakh, the Jewish Bible. They have stayed afloat all these years because they're producing, I think, not only the Bibles, which keep them afloat, because they produce really good English language educational materials for educational settings. And so that's really what their niche is, right? It's great Jewish books. Barry Schwartz likes to talk about the idea of accessible scholarship, right? In other words, it's scholarship, right? And again, guys, my stuff isn't scholarship. It uses scholarship. I'm more of a popular writer. I know what I know. Okay. The real scholars, the guys, we're sitting there, in university settings, they use real scholarly stuff, some of which I borrow. And what JPS asks them to do is to write a book that any person could pick up and get something out of, right? That is not a book that, you're going to open up on page 1 and say, I don't know what to do with this. I can't understand what he's talking about. So JPS has done a magnificent job. of that for over 130 years. And you should know that JPS is an imprint of a larger university press, which is the University of Nebraska. So the folks I work with are the folks at JPS and the folks at University of Nebraska Press, all of whom are really magnificent. Talk about process, by the way, if we have a minute, I'll tell you what I think is a funny story. Here's my funny story. In the final stretches of writing this book about, I don't know, 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, I'm sitting at a retreat center in the middle of the winter. And my managing editor, Joy Weinberg, who's the managing editor at JPS, who's a magnificent editor and has really become a tremendous support to me in terms of teaching me how to write. We both agreed that the end of the book was terrible. I wrote this piece of junk, 14 pages long. It felt like a bad sermon by a rabbinical student. She said, "You got to get rid of it." I said, "You're right. I got to get rid of it." I sit down. I'm looking out over the frozen Hudson River. Boom! Inspiration. I start writing like a crazy man in the library of this retreat center. Right? Nobody around. Very quiet. Very beautiful. The good Lord has opened up all the pistons are running. You know. And I'm writing, and I send her back this piece. And about 3 hours later, she writes me back and she says, "Dan, very inspired, very creative ending to the book. Now, I'd like you to take a look at my edited version. I cut out 65% of what you wrote," right? Because that's what a good editor does. That's what she did. It was amazing. She taught me so much about how creativity has to be met by, right, a certain set of disciplines and rules about sort of how one writes. So that's my process.
Okay, Rabbi, I want to bring in Moshe. So Moshe,
yeah, Moshe had a question.
If you can unmute yourself, and I want to introduce Moshe. Moshe is calling in from Uganda. And he has a whole community of Jews who are in his Jewish community. So Moshe, go ahead, unmute yourself and give us your question. You've been very patient.
What happened to him?
I don't know. I think he is on a phone and he has bad connection. So, unfortunately, we will not hear from him. But it's what's amazing and what has come about for me, which was remarkably pinchable moment, is that there are now communities in Uganda, Mali, Nigeria, all over the world are coming together to learn about education as Jews, because they are starving in Africa for Jewish education. So they're coming to the group and we're excited to have them. And I'm sorry that he couldn't speak. So
Jeffrey, could you do me a favor? If you're in touch with Moshe, ask him just to email me.
I will. I am in discussion with all of these people on a daily basis. So
that's
I
great.
can
I'd
easily,
love to be in touch with you. Not a problem.
All right. Is there anything else, or we can organically put the program to a close? Some of you asked about recording. The challenge that I am having with recording is that this is over a 2 gigabyte file, which means you cannot email this file to anybody. And further, I have to get permissions from the people who asked the questions in the audience and gave away your personal insights. So it's been a problem for me to share these recordings. And I'm pretty much spending a lot of time as it is. I really don't want to have legal issues regarding digital rights. So I have really not made recordings, though they are recorded, they are not being shared with anybody outside of the speaker's audience. So sorry about that, but I hope that you all had a terrific time, as I did with Rabbi Dan Orenstein.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Joanna. So you know, thank you.
And I also want to let you know that on November 7th, I'm just going to put in chat right now for all of you to see. Hold on a minute. Wait a minute. Sorry.
Oh, Moshe's back on. Moshe's back on.
Moshe, can we hear you, Moshe? Has a very difficult connection.
Yeah.
There. So hold on a second. I want to just make sure that you see this. Well, anyway, November 7th is with Guri Stark, It's a program about Holocaust art. And he has a very intriguing presentation. It's literally right around the corner next week. So we hope that whatever you saw today, you're going to come back and be with us again with us on the 7th. And on November 14th, we have a very special presentation with Cara De Silva, who wrote The Hidden Memories of Recipes in Terezin. Not quite the title that it is, but she's going to join us as well. Terrific speaker there. So we have a lot of really interesting programming coming up. I hope you all return and tell your friends about it and have them come and join us. Thanks again, Dan.
Thanks again, everybody.
Really appreciated our friendship.
Thank you, guys.
And we'll be in touch.
Absolutely. Thanks again, folks.
Bye.